Okay, let's have our Q&A, and I see a lot of questions here, great questions from around the room. So again, just going to open it to the floor. So please shoot up your hand. Don't be table 13 today. So table 3 here. We'll wait till we get a microphone to you, Brendan. Thanks. Oh, table 3 here. Sorry, yeah.
How are you, Brendan? When seeking planning permission to build a house, county councils can require the removal of hedgerows and biodiversity in situations where it's not necessary. What's the reason for this?
So, Andy or Shirley, would you like to take that one about?
I'll answer that. So generally the reason for that is for road safety, for sight lines that they impose for coming out an entranceway, or, you know, so that for visibility for traffic and for pedestrians. But I think what should happen is that if there's a removal of a hedgerow required, that it should be minimised, first of all, which is often not, and it can be set back. You know, you can actually lift a hedgerow and set it back when it's dormant. You can dig a trench and move it in its entirety, and there are methods for doing that. And then encouraging, obviously, more nature on the site, the development site. So I think there should be nature positive requirements for all developments that are happening here from now on in the countryside. We can't say we're in a biodiversity loss situation and then not ask for people to do more.
Thanks, Shirley. Two hands up from table 2. And did you ask a question yesterday, by any chance? We might give it to your colleague. Thanks, Conor.
Hi, my name is Tony. This is a question for Andy. What powers do the National Parks and Wildlife Service have to designate an area a special area of conservation? You could argue that maybe the whole country should be designated an SAC. So can you impose that on a farmer or a group or around an urban area? And I have a two-part to the question. If you had the powers tomorrow, what actions would you implement from the 162 actions that you've drawn up for the National Biodiversity Action Plan?
Thank you. So we're obliged, as I was saying in my presentation, to designate at EU level a suite of habitats that represent the best sites to protect those habitats and species in Ireland. So that legal obligation is there, that each member state must select the best sites for designation. That's then when it gets complicated. How do you engage and notify the landowners and land users of those sites that this burden is coming at them, and how do they react to that? There's a right of appeal, obviously, in relation to the designation as it relates to their lands. But assuming it passes through that appeals process and is still designated, what can't happen is that that land then becomes devalued in the mind of the landowner or the farmer. There has to be an incentive there for the appropriate management of that land. And we seek all opportunities to get incentives provided in that way through the CAP strategic plan, through life projects, through incentives to encourage better management of the land. So that's really, really important. Designation is not the end. In fact, it's only the start of the management of the land. So it has to be a prompt and a precursor to the next steps. In relation to what I would like best out of the 162 actions that are currently in the draft plan, I think a cross-government approach to the responsibility and the burden of the management of nature and biodiversity. As I said in my presentation, it can't only depend on one arm of the state. NPWS is completely committed to doing that, but there are funds out with our control. There's land that we don't own. We depend on sectoral interests across a range of government departments. So a national position at government level, but beyond government, buying hearts and minds in the wider landscape with farmers, with landowners, with people who care about biodiversity, citizens of the state. That's my nirvana. I'm not sure that's just one action, but if it was, it would be a great one to deliver.
Can I just follow up on that? Because it's a really good question, Tony, and I'm conscious that we'll have some farmers in next weekend that we meet up. And I've been trying to talk to as many farmers as possible. And a lot of them have said that when their land is designated as an SAC, they often get told, and that is the end of it. And they've said, there's no more communication, and I don't know what I'm supposed to do. And that's how the land gets devalued, because there's no management of it. Some of them are saying they got a letter recently, but that's the only communication they've had in years. Is that a resourcing matter? Is it a strategy matter?
It certainly isn't strategy. I think it's a failed experiment if we choose to enforce designation on people without dialoguing with them. I suppose the challenge is to be better resourced to do that better in the future, maybe accepting the sins of the past and how we did it imperfectly and imprecisely in the past. I think in future, going forward, if further designation is required, I think it will be expected that MPWS directly engage with the affected landowners to agree how this is going to impact upon them, and therefore, arising from that, what are the burdens that fall to them and what are the incentives and the compensations that would come.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Okay, table, now Stephen, I missed you in the last time, so I'll take that question from table 7. Thanks, Caroline.
Yeah, from our table here. Just from our table here that we were discussing there, and we said that in Ireland, how many biodiversity Pacific court cases were taken and the results from those prosecutions in the last 5 years. We were discussing the impact that pollution have by big business and like what's the result of it. Has there been any research done on it? Any correlation? So that's basically our
Okay,
question.
thank you, Stephen. And Shirley, maybe that comes to you in terms of enforcement. Is there any, what happens?
Thanks for your question. I can't answer the specifics on that. I don't have the numbers on how many cases. I know that there have been cases taken at an EU level. So, for example, for not implementing like the Natura directives or the EU Habitats directives properly. But then there are the local cases. So there had been a huge gap in the taking of cases for like hedgerow removal and mismanagement of hedges in the closed season. There had been very few cases taken on that by the National Parks and Wildlife. I'm speaking, sorry, on your behalf now, Andy. But that increased last year. Not in Monaghan now, but it did increase elsewhere, and there were farmers fined considerable amount of money. Well, small amount, if you 6,000 euros in one case for removal of maybe a few kilometres of hedges. So there has been an increase in enforcement by the National Parks and Wildlife, but the message needs to go out there more strongly. I would suggest that who is going to bring a case to court? Who has the resources to follow through on the continuity of evidence requirements needed to go to court? Is there an ecologist that photographed the evidence at the right time? Have you got the maps before and afterwards? Are you sure who actually carried out the works? There's all sorts of, obstacles in the way for the enforcement of legislation, but it can be done, and I think it should be done better and clearer. But citizens need to know where they can go to enforce legislation or who they can go to ask. And oftentimes I'm not even clear on where to go or who to ask when people ring me. And I work in the local authority. And that's not because I'm not dedicated to my job. I have a wide brief of natural, cultural and built heritage. But simply sometimes I just can't, it's not clear. And I think clarity, transparency and ease of access is required, and I would be in favour of a specialist environmental court that particularly allowed for the quick resolution. So instead of a case sitting in limbo for a long time on the court list, for example, while damage continues to happen or while a habitat remains unrepaired or unrestored, that it can go quicker to an environmental court and the biodiversity remedy can happen much sooner. It makes more sense for everybody.
Okay, thank you very much, Shirley. Robert, your hand was up next, and then I'll go over here.
Hi, yeah, Robert from Troublesome Table 6. Apologies. Over the last couple of weeks and months we've been doing this, the one thing that's become to the fore for us has been communication, or lack of communications to all the different organisations. Questions directly for yourself, Shirley. How often do you communicate with Andy? And how easy is that communication? and don't look to your left.
Well, unfortunately, I've seen Andy quite a bit recently because we've been at the same events, but that's on. I don't usually see you.
It's been a pleasure when we meet, always, for me anyway.
It's lovely to see you, Andy. But Andy as a corporate body, shall we say, and myself as a corporate body, so the MPWS and Monaghan County Council, We do liaise but I would say not sufficiently. We liaise mainly because we've been running an EU project in Monaghan to protect peatlands. So Andy and Rebecca have been members of our steering group, which meets biannually. So we have been meeting about that project, and it's a north-south project. So we have also been meeting with our colleagues in Dira in Northern Ireland. And shall I say that that's an issue for border counties, is this shared island nature of our biodiversity. It doesn't end at the border, and we have a very long border in Monaghan. Like, a lot of our biodiversity resource depends on what's happening on the other side, so we have to take this shared island approach as well. But we don't see enough of each other, should we say, can I say that? At all levels. So, right from, we would maybe get communications from the department, but we don't have enough formalised meetings involving maybe more than me. You know what I mean? So talking to our engineers and our planners, and likewise, different units in the department, because there simply aren't enough people to liaise with each other. If we liaise with each other all the time, we wouldn't get any work done. Do you know what I mean? So we need, there's definitely a need for better systems, but systems need resourcing. And Andy's a lovely person to meet, obviously. And he's a very dedicated member of the National Parks and
Wildlife. Thank you, Shirley. Now we've two hands up, Louise and Neves, and I think it's I'll take both, and then we'll bring it, because I think they're both kind of for Shirley. Yes.
Hi, I'm Louise. So this is just from the table. So can heritage officers flag, or maybe have the foresight to flag, species that have the potential to become endangered, and how can they plan ahead or plan for supports to kind of reverse that endangerment?
That's a very good question.
Before you answer that, Shirley, I'm going to take another question, because we may run out of time. So is there a table from question 10?
I'll just give this one to my
Perfect.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Ben. So we were interested in the point you made, Andy, about 90% of the land being privately owned in Ireland, and that being out of step maybe with other countries. And we were interested in knowing if that was a particularly Irish challenge, I suppose, when it comes to biodiversity. Would it be better if more of the land was publicly owned? Like, it might not be, that might just mean nobody's responsible for it, And so I suppose that was one question. Would it be better if, more of the land was publicly owned? And then the follow-up to that is the constitutional right to private land ownership a barrier to more publicly owned land, and therefore a barrier to biodiversity, or protecting biodiversity?
Great question, Ben. So Shirley, would you mind addressing Louise's question first about the animals, and then Andy, I'll bring this back to you. Thank you.
Sure. Because we work at a local level, we have been able to identify changes in species, because we've been doing projects or baseline studies through the Heritage Council plan funding, and through our heritage. We have heritage and biodiversity plans at a county level. So, for example, we're in our third one now. From the point of view of species, I know that heritage officers in the Midlands identified the swift population as being in decline, and started to do quite a lot of work surveying those in conjunction with Birdwatch Ireland, for example, and have now managed to get objectives into some of the county development plans that publicly owned buildings should have swift boxes and things like that on them, so that we can actually facilitate the continued populations of swifts in some of the small towns. So we have a role there. What I would say is that we could be an enhanced role. They've started to employ biodiversity officers now in local authorities. So just to say that the Minister announced 10 biodiversity officers, one for 10 local authorities, to be in place by the end of this year, which will be a great addition, and there's more planned. But that's really only the beginning, as far as I can see, of what's required to be able to continue to identify these types of gaps.
Just on that, Shirley, do all counties have to have a heritage and biodiversity plan, or is it just because you have someone who's very interested in Monaghan?
No, it's not a statutory objective, but it is in the National Heritage Plan and the National Biodiversity Plan that local authorities should develop local biodiversity and heritage plans. And we have memorandums and circulars from the department, I think, to that effect as well. But there's no legislative basis.
Thank you. And Andy, the question from Ben.
Yep. Thanks, Ben. That's a really astute and well-posed question. The answer is, I think Ireland is kind of at the top of the table when it comes to land in private ownership, and very close to the top of the table again for lands of that subset that is farmed. So that's both a challenge and an opportunity. I have a colleague who often refers to the management of land in private ownership by farmers as being the porridge is either too hot or too cold, that Goldilocks analogy. So how do you get the correct temperature of the porridge? I don't think if the state took ownership of those lands, we'd have porridge that would be worth eating because we wouldn't have the resources to actually manage the land to the extent that depends on farmers. The question for me is how do we engage the farming community to work out themselves how they deliver porridge at the correct temperature through a variety of different means, through their own initiative, intuitive approaches, and through that scorecard approach that James mentioned earlier. As long as we describe what the outcome is, how they get to that end point is up to them and they have that control, but to reward them for so doing. So I don't look at land being in state ownership being an obstacle. It's just a reality that we have to deal with, and we need to get better at engaging with those who manage those lands.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you for those questions. Thank you sincerely for Shirley and Andy for giving up their Sunday morning to be here with us as well. We're going to take 15 minutes and we'll start our next session at 11:30. So stretch your legs and we're into the final presentations for today.